But I think there are visible manifestations of the debt now showing up in deteriorating loan quality for the banks, and the combination of debt-intensive growth and deteriorating loan quality is a classic early warning sign of a potential crisis, which is why this needs to be addressed sooner rather than later.
But what would the crisis be? Would it be a sudden arrest in growth and sort of we go down to the 4s, 5s, or even?
That would be the worst case outcome, and that's what I'm addressing, in the talk today. I'm saying, okay, let's just assume that all the concerns about China, most of which I do not share, come to pass, and the Chinese economy slows to a very, very low, if not negative growth rate over the course of the next 5 years. What would this mean for China? What would this mean for the world?
Because a world without China is a world without China's growth.
Absolutely.
And if we hadn't had China's growth since the global financial crisis,
we'd be in recession right now.
Yes.
The world would be.
Yes.
So that's the scenario that I'm going to address.
And to some extent, this problem has actually sort of gone off the. It has not been the key issue of 2016. There's been other issues like Brexit, the US election, and Chinese growth hasn't.
Well, but the Chinese growth rate has been stable.
Yes.
In 2016, a year ago, there was widespread concern that China was on the brink of a crisis. Those fears turned out to have been overblown a year ago, but they haven't gone away. It's the intensity that's diminished. And so now, with some of these other political issues, at least having come to the surface, have been addressed by the polls in either Brexit, Trump, but there's still some issues out there in continental Europe like France and Italy that need to be addressed. But I think now what we're going to see is sort of a return back to this earlier debate that we had a year ago.
But the world without China's growth
is going to be a very difficult place.
And is this going to come? I mean, even if China's growth becomes more normalized, it's not going to be the growth engine it was before.
The world is going to be lacking a major growth engine. There's no question about it.
The U.S. can't provide it.
Well, that's a debate. I don't think the U.S. will. I don't think Europe will. And I don't think the rest of Asia will either. I don't think the resource economies will. I think the world itself, if there is a dramatic slowdown in China, will be in a period of weakness that we have not seen at any point since the end of World War II.
Because it's always had a growth engine.
That's right.
The world has always had a growth engine.
And it doesn't have one.
And it doesn't have one. But I mean, China's been a growth engine since since the last decade.
Yes.
Before that, it was
U.S. Europe was a little bit more, but the lack of a growth engine is a critical risk factor in this globalized environment that we're in.
And if it doesn't have a growth engine, it doesn't grow, basically.
Yeah, then a lot of the structural problems with respect to jobs, the pushback against globalization will only intensify.
And jobs will mean getting used to higher levels of unemployment generally.
Well, there's been a lot of structural unemployment since the end of the financial crisis, and the hope is that in a rising global growth environment that will begin to absorb the structural unemployment. But in a world without China, that will not happen.
How will that affect China itself, though? Because China depends on world growth as well. It's a two-way traffic, isn't it?
It is, but the strategy, the concept of Chinese rebalancing is to recognize that the world itself is not providing the lift to China that it did in the post-1980 reforms and opening up era, and that China needs to turn more toward internal demand as a source for economic growth and job creation in China. And it's internal demand driven by private consumption. It's internal demand driven by the growth and development of China's services sector. Those are both less sources of growth in China that are much less dependent on the external environment.
And can't the Chinese consumer actually be an engine for global growth as well?
A lot of that depends on where we go in this trade debate. See, we're starting now. In this trade debate, can the developed world succeed in getting access to rapidly expanding, rapidly growing domestic Chinese markets? And I have some views on that I'll express at lunch.
Right. In terms of the Trump presidency,
You mean he won? He won?
I think so.
Oh.
The fiscal expansion he's actually planning, we talked about that briefly recently. The markets are quite positive about this fiscal expansion at the moment.
Yeah, the markets are building in a lot of optimism with respect to the Trump plan. And I think what has not been addressed is the point I discussed with you on the telephone the other day, and that is that fiscal expansion for a low savings economy spells budget deficits, wider current account imbalances, and bigger trade deficits. And that's on a collision course with the protectionist policies that Mr. Trump is also prescribing. So right now in the markets, it's all blue sky and optimism as opposed to dealing with some of these tougher issues that may be evident down the road.
And the U.S.-China relations, you've written a lot about the codependency between the U.S. and China. How do you expect U.S.-China relations to develop under the Trump presidency? We've already.
Well, right now they look terrible.
Yeah.
There's a lot of pressure that's arisen over Taiwan and the one-child issue. I am hopeful, but I have to say every time I've been hopeful with respect to Mr. Trump, I've been disappointed. I'm still hopeful that the Trump administration will use Taiwan as a point of leverage to still commit to a stronger U.S.-China relationship, hopefully framed around a bilateral investment treaty. I think that would be good news for the United States, good news for China, and a way to push this relationship forward. But I would be the first to confess that my conviction on that has been shaken in the last 2 weeks by the tensions that have emerged over the Taiwan issue.
Will you actually be going to Davos in January?
I'm not going to go to Davos.
You're not going to?
No.
But what do you think will be one of the big talking points at Davos? Will it all be Trump?
I think the presence of Xi Jinping will be very important, but what is China's role in the Davos debate, which has always been a globalization debate? Where is globalization headed? China has been a huge beneficiary of globalization.
And a driver.
And a driver, but now there's a lot of pushback against globalization. That's what Brexit's all about. That's what the ascendancy of Trump is all about. That's what potentially the election of Marine Le Pen is all about, and the likely pressures that will be actively debated and discussed at Davos on the future of the European Union. So how China fits into that debate is a big issue.
And Xi Jinping, what message do you think they'll be wanting to hear from Xi Jinping at Davos?
That Xi Jinping hears the concerns and the questions that are being raised about globalization, and that China is still committed to dealing with global issues, from climate change to trade, to opening its markets and opening its borders warmly to other nations around the world.
What's the
I know all about it.
biggest challenges of this
Okay,
time?
okay.
Yeah.
China's push to supply side reforms is welcome and important, but it is not an excuse for rebalancing the demand side of the equation. And while the work report of the Premier placed very high priority on supply side initiatives, as did the 13th five-year plan, what concerns me is now there's almost too much focus on the supply side without continuing to underscore the commitment toward consumer-led growth on the demand side. You need both supply and demand to drive China to the next phase and avoid the middle income trap.